The Battle of Messines was an offensive conducted by the British Second Army, under the command of General Sir Herbert Plumer, on the Western Front near the village of Messines in Belgian West Flanders during the First World War. The naval offensive in April and May had failed to achieve its more ambitious aims, led to the demoralization of French troops and the dislocation of the Anglo-French strategy for 1917. The offensive at Messines forced the Germans to move reserves to Flanders from the Arras and Aisne fronts, which relieved pressure on the French. The tactical objective of the attack at Messines was to capture the German defences on the ridge which ran from Ploegstedt Wood in the south, through Messines and Whiteskeet to Mount Sorel, to deprive the German Fourth Army of the high ground south of Ypres. The ridge commanded the British defences and back areas further north, from which the British intended to conduct the northern operation, to advance to Passchendaele Ridge, then capture the Belgian coast up to the Dutch frontier. The Second Army had 5 corps, of which 3 conducted the attack and 2 remained on the northern flank, not engaged in the main operation. The 14th Corps was available in General Headquarters Reserve. The 4th Army divisions of Gruppe-Whichchat held the ridge, which were later reinforced by a division from Gruppe-Wypern. The battle began with the detonation of a series of mines beneath German lines, which created 19 large craters and devastated the German front-line defences. This was followed by a creeping barrage 700 yards deep, covering the British troops as they secured the ridge with support from tanks, cavalry patrols and aircraft. The effectiveness of the British mines, barrages and bombardments was improved by advances in artillery survey, flash spotting and centralized control of artillery from the Second Army headquarters. British attacks from 8 to 14 June advanced the front line beyond the former German Saanen line. The Battle of Messines was a prelude to the much larger Third Battle of Ypres campaign, the preliminary bombardment for which began on the 11th of July 1917. Background: British Plans 1916–1917 in 1916. The British planned to clear the German army from the Belgian coast to prevent them from using the coastal ports as bases from which to attack merchant ships and troop transports in the North Sea and English Channel. In January 1916, General Sir Herbert Plumer recommended to Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig the capture of Messines Ridge before an operation to capture the Gelleveld Plateau further north. The Flanders campaign was postponed because of the German offensive at Verdun and the demands of the Battle of the Somme. When it became apparent that the naval offensive had failed to achieve its most ambitious objectives, Haig instructed the Second Army to capture the Messines-Whiteskeet Ridge as soon as possible. Haig intended to force the Germans to move troops away from the French armies on the Aisne front, where demoralization amid the failure of the naval offensive had led to a number of mutinies. British operations in Flanders would relieve pressure on the French army, as the Battle of the Somme had done. The capture of Messines Ridge would give the British control of the strategically important ground on the southern flank of the Ypres salient, shorten the front, deprive the Germans of observation over British positions further north, and would occupy ground from which the British could observe the southern slope of Menin Ridge at the west end of the Gelleveld Plateau. In preparation for a larger offensive in the Ypres salient, the front line around Ypres had changed relatively little since the end of the Second Battle of Ypres. The British held the city, while the Germans held the high ground of the Messines-Whiteskeet Ridge to the south, the lower ridges to the east and the flat ground to the north. The Ypres front was a salient bulging into the German lines but was overlooked by German artillery observers on the higher ground. The British had little ground observation of the German rear areas and valleys east of the ridges. The ridges ran north and east from Messines, 264 feet above sea level at its highest point, past Clapham Junction, at the west end of the Gelleveld Plateau. 2.5 miles from Ypres at 213 feet, and Gelleveld, which was above 164 feet, to Passchendaele, 5.5 miles from Ypres at 164 feet above sea level, declining from there to a plain further north. Gradients varied from negligible to 1 to 60 at Hooge and 133 at Zonnebaker. Underneath the soil was London clay, sand and silt. Since the First Battle of Ypres in 1914, much of the drainage in the area had been destroyed by artillery fire, although some repairs had been achieved by Army land drainage companies brought from England. The area was considered by the British to be drier than Lewes, Givenchy and Plug Street Wood further south.